The orange eviction notice clung to Margaret Reynolds' apartment door like a death sentence. 30 days. That's all they had left before she, 8-year-old Luke, and their aging retriever Rusty would be homeless. Margaret, now 48, peeled it off slowly, her teacher's hands trembling slightly. Inside, the apartment was quiet, save for the soft scratching of Rusty's paws as he followed her into the kitchen. The refrigerator's glow illuminated the barren shelves. Half a carton of milk, some wilting vegetables, and a few eggs. Margaret sighed, her fingers reflexively touching the simple gold band she still wore 3 years after Richard had walked out. "Mom, are we having cereal again?" Luke stood in the doorway, small for his 8 years, with her dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. His Spider-Man pajamas had grown too short at the ankles. "Just for tonight, buddy." She managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tomorrow I'll make something special." Another lie in a growing collection. The elementary school where she'd taught for 12 years had closed last month. Budget cuts. Richard hadn't paid child support in 6 months. The bank account was empty. As Luke ate, Margaret sorted through the mail. Bills, more bills, a collection notice. At the bottom of the stack sat an envelope different from the others. Heavier paper, an actual wax seal pressed with unfamiliar initials. The return address read, Thornwood, Barrett and Sullivan, Attorneys at Law, Portland, Maine. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Dear Ms. Reynolds," it began, formal and distant, "we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Eleanor Pierce, who departed this life on October 3rd. As the sole surviving heir to Mr. Pierce's estate, we are contacting you regarding the inheritance of his property located at 6780 Shadowpine Road, Millbrook County, Maine." Margaret read the words 3 times before they began to make sense. Eleanor Pierce. The name tugged at a distant memory. Her grandmother mentioning a great-uncle, someone who'd gone away during the war. Which war? She couldn't recall. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the past. "Our family has always found strength in difficult times, Maggie. It's in your blood." The memory brought unexpected comfort. "Mom, what is it?" Luke asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing, honey. Just grown-up stuff." That evening, after Luke was asleep, Margaret called the number on the letterhead. She expected a receptionist, perhaps an answering service at such a late hour. Instead, an elderly man answered directly. "Sullivan speaking. This is Margaret Reynolds. I received a letter about—" "Ah, yes, Ms. Reynolds." His voice sounded like autumn leaves rustling. "I'm glad you called. We weren't certain we'd located the right person." "I don't understand," Margaret said, pacing her small living room. "I never even met this Eleanor Pierce. Why would he leave me anything?" A pause long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. Mr. Pierce was an intensely private individual. No children, no living relatives that we could locate except through historical records. Your grandmother was his niece, his closest living relation before she passed, and you are her only descendant. Sullivan hesitated, then added, "I knew Eleanor for many years. We served together, a lifetime ago. But there must be some mistake." "The inheritance is quite clear," Sullivan interrupted gently. "Though I must warn you, the property has been unoccupied for some time. Mr. Pierce lived there alone for many decades. The house is quite remote. Millbrook is more of a hamlet than anything else. The nearest grocery store is about 40 minutes away." Remote, isolated, in the middle of nowhere. To Margaret facing eviction, it sounded like salvation. Are you listening to this story right now? Can you imagine being in Margaret's position, facing homelessness 1 minute and inheriting a mysterious property the next? What would you do? Think about it for a moment as our story continues. 2 weeks later, Margaret's ancient Honda struggled up the winding roads of northern Maine, the trunk and back seat packed with their meager possessions. Luke pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass. Rusty lay on a blanket beside him, gray muzzle resting on his paws, occasionally whining as the car jolted over potholes. The highways had given way to state routes, then to county roads, and finally to barely paved tracks that wound through forests so dense they swallowed the weak November sunlight. They'd passed the last gas station an hour ago, and the last house, abandoned, windows like hollow eyes, perhaps 20 minutes back. "Are there other kids where we're going?" Luke asked. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'm not sure, honey. It might be just us for a while." The trees here were different from anything Margaret had ever seen. Massive pines stretched skyward, branches heavy with old snow. And there was something else. Darker, more primeval trees that seemed to lean toward the road as they passed. They saw the first warning sign at a fork in the road. Yellow metal, weathered but readable. Restricted area. Authorized personnel only. "What does that mean?" Luke asked, suddenly alert. "Probably old signs," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "From a long time ago." More signs appeared as they continued. Military property and no trespassing. Government testing site. The GPS had lost signal miles back, so Margaret relied on Sullivan's printed directions, following increasingly obscure landmarks. When they finally found Shadow Pine Road, it wasn't really a road at all, more like two dirt ruts separated by a spine of frozen grass. On either side, the forest pressed close, branches scratching against the car windows. And then, suddenly, the trees opened to reveal a perfect circular clearing. In the center sat the house. It was larger than Margaret had expected. 2 stories, built from dark stone and weathered timber. Old, clearly, but not in the way she'd anticipated. She'd expected derelict, abandoned, falling apart. Instead, the house looked almost pristine. The roof was intact, the windows unbroken. Even the paint on the front door, a deep burgundy, looked fresh. But surrounding the property at irregular intervals were more of those yellow warning signs, mounted on metal poles driven deep into the frozen ground. As they pulled up to the house, Rusty began to growl. A low rumble that Margaret had rarely heard from the gentle dog. "It's okay, boy," she said, reaching back to stroke his head. "This is home now." The front door was solid wood with an iron lock that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. The key from Sullivan slid in with surprising ease. The door swung open, and Margaret stepped inside. The first thing that struck her was the smell, not musty or abandoned, but clean, almost antiseptic, with an underlying hint of something metallic. The air inside was warmer than outside, as if the heating system was still running. "Hello!" Margaret called, her voice echoing through the hallway. Nothing, of course. The house had been empty since October. The entryway opened into a large main room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but underneath she could make out the shapes of a couch, chairs, tables, all seemingly untouched by time. The wooden floor was dusty but not rotted. The walls were paneled in dark wood, without cracks or water damage. Luke ventured further into the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Mom! There's a kitchen and it's huge!" Margaret followed him, her unease growing with each step. The kitchen was indeed massive, dominated by an enormous cast iron stove. But it was the cabinets that made her stop short. They were full. Not just full, but stocked, like someone was expecting the end of the world. Can after can, jar after jar, all lined up with military precision. Margaret pulled one down. The label was faded but still legible. U.S. Army Field Rations, Beans and Bacon, 1946. Nearly 80 years ago. Upstairs they found 4 bedrooms, all furnished, all covered in protective sheeting. One room was clearly a child's bedroom with a small bed and toys that looked like museum pieces. Tin soldiers, a wooden train set, alphabet blocks. In the master bedroom, they found military dog tags. Pierce Eleanor A., serial number 13478290. Blood type O positive. A Purple Heart medal. Photographs of men in uniform standing in front of this very house. But it was the photograph on the nightstand that made Margaret pick it up with trembling hands. It showed a man, perhaps in his 30s, standing in the clearing outside. Behind him, clearly visible, were the warning signs. But what made Margaret's heart race was the date stamped on the back, March 8th, 1949. If this was Eleanor Pierce, then he'd been young in this photo, very young, which meant he'd have to be in his 90s when he died. Over 100. As the afternoon faded into evening, Rusty refused to enter certain rooms, standing at thresholds with his hackles raised, whining softly. Margaret found a generator shed behind the house, humming with power. That explained the electricity. Next to it was a propane tank, also full, connected to a heating system that was keeping the house at a steady temperature. It was as if someone had prepared the house to run indefinitely without human intervention. As if Eleanor Pierce had known he would die and had set everything up to preserve his home exactly as it was. That night, after they had eaten a surprisingly good meal of canned stew, dated 1947, and made beds in one of the guest rooms, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. Luke slept soundly beside her, Rusty curled at the foot of the bed. She must have dozed off because she woke with a start to complete darkness and absolute silence, the kind of silence that was almost physical, pressing against her eardrums. And then she heard it, a sound from below, from beneath the house. Not a normal house sound. It was rhythmic, mechanical, a low hum rising and falling, and beneath that, something else that might have been voices or machinery or something she didn't have words for. At the foot of the bed, Rusty stood rigid, staring at the floor, a low growl building in his throat. Margaret sat up slowly, her heart hammering. The sound continued, pulsing up through the floorboards, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. From the basement maybe, or from even deeper. How deep did this house go? Have you ever been awakened in the night by strange sounds you couldn't explain? That moment when your heart races and you wonder if you should investigate or hide under the covers? Margaret is feeling that right now. If you're enjoying this story, remember to like and subscribe for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now let's see what Margaret discovers. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Margaret had barely slept after the strange noises subsided around 4 a.m. Luke mercifully had slept through it all, and now he was exploring the house with the unbridled enthusiasm of an 8-year-old. She made coffee using grounds from a tin dated 1946. It was surprisingly good, rich, and strong. As she sipped it, looking out the kitchen window at the perfect circle of the clearing, she noticed something she'd missed the day before. A path, barely visible, leading from behind the house into the forest. "Luke, I'm going to look around outside for a bit. Stay in the house, okay?" She bundled up against the cold, whistled for Rusty, and together they followed the path into the woods. The dog seemed eager, trotting ahead, nose to the ground, all his nervousness from the night before apparently forgotten. The path wound through the dense pines for about 50 yards before opening into a smaller clearing. In the center sat a structure Margaret almost missed, so overgrown with vines and moss that it blended into the forest. A concrete bunker with a steel door that reminded her of the basement door in the house. Next to it was a wooden chest, badly weathered. The lock had long since corroded away. Margaret glanced back toward the house. She could just see one of the upstairs windows from here, then carefully pried open the chest. Inside were journals, handwritten. The first page bore a date, January 15th, 1943, and a name, Harold James Pierce. Margaret's breath caught. Pierce? Eleanor's father, perhaps? Her great-grandfather? She sat on the frozen ground, her back against the concrete bunker, and began to read. January 15th, 1943. Arrived at the site today. Security is unlike anything I've ever seen. Guards with machine guns at every checkpoint. They made us sign documents that promised execution for disclosure. I still don't know exactly what we're building. They call it Project Evergreen Sanctuary, well, but that's just a code name. Colonel Brennan says we're constructing the future, that what we do here will ensure America survives no matter what happens in Europe or the Pacific. Margaret flipped through the pages. Harold Pierce had spent 3 years at this site, overseeing construction of something vast and complex. But it was the entry from September 12th, 1944, that made her blood run cold. The first shipment arrived today, trucks at 300 hours, flanked by armored vehicles. I heard the guards talking when they thought no one was listening. Gold, bars of it, hundreds of tons, maybe more. They're storing it in Chamber 7, the deepest section. Colonel Brennan finally told me the truth tonight. Evergreen Sanctuary isn't just a storage facility. It's a hedge against Armageddon. If the war goes south, if Europe falls completely, if the Nazis get the bomb first, America needs to be able to rebuild. They're caching everything here. Gold, documents, seeds, technology, everything needed to restart civilization if the worst happens. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. Gold. Tons of gold hidden beneath this house. Beneath her feet right now. The last entry was dated November 7th, 1945. The war is over. Germany surrendered in May. Japan in August. We won. But Evergreen Sanctuary continues. The shipments keep coming. The chambers keep filling. They're shutting down the construction. Most of the crew is being transferred, sworn to secrecy, scattered to the winds. But someone needs to stay. Someone needs to maintain the facility, watch over it. Eleanor volunteered. My son, my brilliant, patriotic, foolish son. He's 26 years old, and he's volunteering to spend the rest of his life as a watchman for a bunker that officially doesn't exist. I tried to talk him out of it, but you can't argue with Eleanor when he's made up his mind. He says it's his duty. He says someone has to do it. The journal entries ended there, but Margaret found other papers. Letters from Eleanor to his father, spanning decades. The emotional distance in them was heartbreaking. A man slowly disappearing into his duty, becoming less human and more machine with each passing year. The last letter was dated January 3rd, 2023, almost a year ago. Father, though you're long gone, I continue these reports out of habit. I am 87 years old. My health is failing. I've lived my entire adult life in service of a mission that the world has forgotten. I've arranged for the property to pass to the only family member I could locate, Margaret Reynolds, your great-granddaughter through your sister's line. I am tired, Father. So very tired. Soon I will rest, and Evergreen Sanctuary will pass into history, or legend, or nothing at all. Your son, Eleanor. Margaret sat among the frozen leaves and ancient papers, tears running down her cheeks. Eleanor Pierce had spent 60 years of his life guarding a secret that his own government had apparently forgotten. 60 years alone in this house, maintaining systems, watching over gold and artifacts and whatever else was stored in the chambers beneath her feet. Mom! Luke's voice, urgent, carried from the house. Margaret jerked to awareness and hurried back. Luke was at the fireplace, the massive stone structure that dominated the living room. I was just looking at the stones because they're really cool, and I pushed one, and look! He pressed his hand against what looked like a completely ordinary stone. There was a click, barely audible, and then movement. The entire back panel of the fireplace swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it, revealed in the dim light, was a switch panel with 3 heavy-duty switches, labeled in a stenciled military lettering. Power lights, lock, release. Margaret thought of the journals, of Eleanor's letters, of 60 years of lonely duty. She thought of the basement door with its 3 locks, and the sound she'd heard last night, and the possibility of systems still running after 80 years. And she thought of gold. Hundreds of tons of gold hidden in chambers beneath this house. Gold that could change her life. That could give Luke everything he deserved. Her hand trembling, Margaret flipped the first switch. Power. Nothing happened or nothing she could perceive. But somewhere in the walls, something hummed to life. The second switch. Lights. Throughout the house, emergency lights flickered on, embedded in the ceiling molding, casting a cool white glow. The third switch. Lock release. From the kitchen came a sound like a gunshot. 3 heavy metallic thunks in quick succession. The locks on the basement door. They just opened. "Stay here," she told Luke. "Stay in this room. Do not follow me." The basement door stood open, just a crack, no longer sealed. Beyond it, concrete steps descended into darkness. But as Margaret approached, lights flickered on, motion activated, revealing a staircase that went down much farther than any normal basement should go. The stairs opened into a corridor, concrete walls painted institutional gray, with emergency lights embedded in the ceiling every 10 feet. The corridor stretched ahead, ending in a heavy steel door. But there were other doors along the way, each one labeled with stenciled numbers and letters. Chamber 1, Chamber 2, Storage. 3A. The first door was unlocked. Margaret pulled it open and was greeted by a room filled with filing cabinets and metal shelves. Documents, thousands of them, all in protective sleeves. She pulled one at random. Technical specifications for something called a proximity fuse. Another document, detailed manufacturing processes for synthetic rubber. Blueprints for aircraft engines. All stamped classified, all dated between 1942 and 1946. The second chamber was full of seeds, not loose, but in sealed containers, vacuum-packed, preserved in metal bins covered in frost. And then she reached the end of the corridor, the large steel door that sealed off the deepest section of the complex. This one was labeled differently. Chamber 7, restricted authorized personnel only. The door was sealed with a wheel lock, like something from a submarine. Margaret gripped it with both hands and pulled. 1 revolution, 2, 3. With a sound like escaping air, the door swung open. The cold hit her like a wall. This chamber was huge, and the temperature was well below freezing. And in the center, stacked in neat rows, were crates, metal crates, each one stamped with serial numbers and military insignias. U.S. Army, Department of the Treasury, and stenciled on each one in large black letters, Gold Reserve, Authorized Transport. Through the ice where it was thinner, Margaret could see metal, the distinctive yellow gleam of gold. She reached out and began chipping at the ice on the nearest crate. It came away in chunks. She found a latch, worked it free, and pulled. The lid opened with a crack of breaking ice. Inside were bars, gold bars, each one stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury and a serial number dated 1944. Pure gold, gleaming in the emergency lighting. The most beautiful and terrifying thing Margaret had ever seen. She was still staring when the light changed. At the far end of Chamber 7, high up on the wall, a small device had activated. It looked like a camera or sensor, with a light mounted next to it. The light was blinking slowly, rhythmically. Red, yellow, red, yellow. A motion sensor, an active, functioning motion sensor, which meant someone might be monitoring this place, someone might know she was here. The implications crashed over Margaret like a tidal wave. This facility wasn't abandoned, it wasn't forgotten. The government, or someone, was still paying attention, still maintaining surveillance, and she just walked right into their trap. Can you imagine the shock of discovering not just one secret, but layer upon layer of them? What would you do if you were Margaret? Run away or try to claim what's legally yours? As you think about that, remember to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now let's see what happens next. Margaret ran. She slammed the crate closed and rushed back up the corridor. She threw all 3 switches in the fireplace panel to the off position. The locks on the basement door engaged with those same heavy thunks. But it was too late. She'd activated the systems. She'd opened the chambers. Someone somewhere now knew that Evergreen Sanctuary had been breached. That night, a storm rolled in, heavy snow driven by howling winds that made the windows rattle. Around 2 a.m., headlights swept across the bedroom wall. Margaret froze, then crept to the window. A black SUV was moving slowly along the road leading to the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a coincidence. Not out here, not in this weather, not at this hour. They'd come for her, for the gold, for the secret. "Luke," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Wake up, buddy. We need to go." As Luke pulled on his warmest clothes, Margaret gathered their essentials. The journals, her phone, their IDs, what little cash she had. She clipped Rusty's leash to his collar. They slipped out into the storm, the cold hitting them like a physical blow. Margaret led Luke and Rusty away from the house toward the path she'd found earlier, the one that led to the concrete bunker in the woods. The snow was falling so heavily that visibility was down to mere feet. Luke stumbled along beside her, his small hand clutched in hers. Rusty forged ahead, finding the path even when Margaret couldn't see it. They'd gone perhaps 100 yards when Rusty suddenly stopped, growling. Margaret froze, pulling Luke close. A figure materialized out of the snow. A woman, tall and slim, wearing a parka with a fur-lined hood. Behind her, two men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, weapons visible at their sides. "Mrs. Reynolds," the woman said, her voice carrying easily over the storm. "I'm Diana Blackwood. I think we need to talk." Margaret pushed Luke behind her. "We have nothing to talk about." Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I disagree. You've seen something that doesn't belong to you. Something that was never meant to be found." "The house is legally mine," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Everything in it is mine. My great-uncle left it to me. Eleanor Pierce was a caretaker, nothing more. He had no right to pass on what he was guarding." Blackwood took a step closer. "But I'm not unreasonable. We're prepared to offer you compensation, $5 million. In exchange, you sign the property over to us and forget everything you saw down there." $5 million, enough to change their lives forever. But something in Blackwood's eyes made Margaret hesitate. This woman wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to clean up a mess. "And if I refuse?" Margaret asked. Blackwood's smile thinned. "Then things get complicated. What's down there isn't just gold. It's national security. We've protected Evergreen Sanctuary for 80 years. Did you think we'd just let you walk away with it?" Margaret thought quickly. She needed leverage. "I've already sent copies of the journals to my sister," she lied. "Photos of the gold, too. If anything happens to me or Luke, she has instructions to release everything to the media." It was Blackwood's turn to hesitate, her eyes narrowing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Reynolds." "I'm not playing at all. I'm protecting my son." Margaret held Blackwood's gaze. "Let us leave. Tonight. We'll take your deal, but I need guarantees, written documents, legal protection." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Fine. Go back to the house. My associates will remain outside. In the morning, our attorneys will arrive with paperwork and your payment." But Margaret caught a gesture Blackwood made to one of the men. Subtle, barely perceptible in the storm. "We're not going back to the house," Margaret said firmly. "We're leaving now." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the howling wind and Rusty's low growl. Finally, Blackwood stepped aside. "Go," she said, her voice cold. "But understand this. We'll be watching. Always." Margaret didn't wait for her to change her mind. She pulled Luke past Blackwood and her men, heading toward the generator shed she'd spotted behind the house. They needed shelter, just for a little while. Inside was warm, not comfortable, but at least above freezing. As Rusty sniffed around the far corner of the shed, he began pawing at something, a metal toolbox shoved beneath a workbench. Margaret pulled it out and found it unlocked. Inside was a newer journal. She opened it to a random page and found Eleanor's familiar handwriting, but this entry was dated August 9th, 1953, nearly a decade after the war had ended. I've made a discovery that may cost me my life. 2 days ago, I received visitors. A Colonel Harrison and 6 men, claiming to be from Army intelligence. They had orders to inventory and relocate the contents of Evergreen Sanctuary, the gold specifically. Their paperwork looked official, but something felt wrong. When I tried to verify Harrison's credentials, I was told I no longer had clearance for that information. They're going to steal it. I'm certain of it now. This isn't an official relocation. This is a heist dressed up in military paperwork. Father and I spent the last week working around the clock. We've modified the security systems. If anyone tries to remove the gold without the proper access codes, the entire facility will seal itself. Airtight, impenetrable. Margaret's heart raced as she flipped through more pages, finding detailed diagrams of the modifications they'd made. A complex system of steel barriers that could drop from the ceiling at strategic points, sealing off sections and trapping anyone inside. And according to these diagrams, the master control was hidden behind the water heater in the basement, a panel where you could trigger the system manually. Margaret thought of Blackwood and her men, probably already in the house, exploring the bunker. She thought of Eleanor's 60 years of lonely duty, of the letter he'd written just before his death. She had a choice to make. She could run, take Luke and Rusty, drive away, try to disappear before Blackwood could find them. Or she could fight. "Luke," she said, crouching in front of him, "I need you to be very brave. I have to go back to the house. You'll stay here with Rusty." "Mom, no!" Luke's eyes filled with tears. "I know, baby." She hugged him tight. "My grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, used to say, 'The greatest strength of our family is courage in the face of adversity.' I need that courage now." She left him with Rusty and stepped back into the storm. She approached the house from the back. Inside, the house was warm and lit. All the lights on, all the systems running. Margaret could hear voices from below. Blackwood and her men in the bunker. She slipped down the stairs, staying close to the wall. At the bottom, she could see light spilling from Chamber 7. They were all in there, focused on the gold. She moved to the water heater, tucked into an alcove near the base of the stairs. Behind it was a metal panel about 2 feet square, painted the same gray as the walls. She pried it open with her freezing fingers. Inside was a control board with a rotary dial with letters and numbers around its circumference. The sequence was complex. 12 separate positions that had to be engaged in precise order. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the dial. First position, K. She rotated the dial carefully, felt it click into place. Second position, 7. Click. She was on the 6th position when she heard footsteps. Someone coming up the corridor. Margaret froze, squeezed back into the alcove. One of Blackwood's men walked past, talking into a radio. "Yeah, we've got maybe 30 crates cataloged so far. This is the real deal." "Make sure you check the house again," Blackwood's voice crackled back. "She had journals, documentation. I want zero evidence this place exists." The man continued up the stairs. Margaret heard the basement door close behind him. She returned to the control panel, continuing through all 12 positions. On the 12th position, as the dial clicked into place, a deep vibration ran through the walls. Then from somewhere in the complex, a sound like thunder, metal slamming into metal, massive and final. Margaret squeezed out from behind the water heater just in time to see steel walls drop from the ceiling with crashes that shook dust from the rafters, sectioning off the complex into sealed compartments. Shouts from deeper in the facility, Blackwood's voice sharp with alarm. "What's happening? Harrison, report!" The barriers had trapped them, everyone who was in the deep sections of the complex. Blackwood, at least 2 of her men. They were sealed in now. Margaret ran for the stairs. As she burst back into the kitchen, she nearly collided with one of Blackwood's men. His eyes went wide with shock. She grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her strength. The man went down hard. She grabbed his radio and ran for the front door. Behind her, from the basement, she could hear muffled screaming. The trapped intruders, realizing they were sealed in. The barriers were airtight. Eleanor's journal had said they had maybe 12 to 18 hours of oxygen. Margaret retrieved Luke and Rusty from the generator shed, wrapped them in every blanket she could find, and settled them in the Honda with the engine running for heat. She used the stolen radio to call for help. The county sheriff, a gruff man named Bennett, promised to come and to bring help. Real help, not Blackwood's kind. As dawn broke, Margaret saw vehicles approaching. Police cruisers, followed by unmarked SUVs. Sheriff Bennett was in the lead car. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We received an interesting call about 7 hours ago from the FBI. They said they'd received evidence of illegal activity at this address. Classified material, potential theft of government property. Then we get your radio call. You want to tell me what's going on?" So Margaret told him everything about inheriting the house, discovering the bunker, finding the gold, being confronted by Blackwood and her team. She showed him Eleanor's journals, the diagrams of the security system, the code to release the barriers. Within hours, the property was swarming with federal agents. It took them 6 hours to carefully release the barriers and extract the trapped intruders. Blackwood and her men were arrested, but it was the gold that caused the real chaos. When the FBI cataloged the contents, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The gold bars had serial numbers that matched a shipment that had officially been lost in transit in 1944. The current value, according to Treasury estimates, $215 million. It was the biggest recovery of lost government assets in American history, and it had been sitting under a house in rural Maine for 80 years, guarded by one lonely man who devoted his entire life to a duty no one remembered. 18 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of her Vermont bookstore, watching the first snow of the season drift down onto the village green. Inside, customers browsed the shelves, the soft murmur of conversation mingling with classical music from hidden speakers. It had taken nearly a year of legal wrangling before the government reached a settlement. Margaret couldn't keep the gold. It belonged to the American people, had always belonged to the American people. But she was entitled to compensation, a finder's fee, her lawyers called it, $12 million. Not the fortune that had been sitting in those chambers, but more than Margaret had ever dreamed of having. Enough to change her life, to give Luke everything he needed. The New Haven Book Emporium had been her dream for years, a place where people could gather, browse, talk about ideas. The second floor housed a community space where she hosted reading groups, author events, and children's story hours. Luke, now 10, was thriving in his new school. Rusty, against all odds, was still with them. Slower now, but comfortable in his old age, with the best veterinary care money could buy. The Pierce Reynolds Foundation, which she'd established with part of the settlement, supported veterans struggling with the aftermath of classified service, people like Eleanor, who'd given everything for missions the world would never know about. As twilight fell and the last customers departed, Margaret closed up shop and walked the short distance to their Victorian home on Maple Street. Luke was at a friend's house for dinner. She had the evening to herself. She poured a glass of wine and settled into her favorite chair by the fireplace. Eleanor's last journal open on her lap. Rusty, dozing on the hearth rug, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A moment later, Margaret heard it too, a soft knock at the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, she could make out a figure, someone tall, standing patiently in the falling snow. Margaret opened the door to find an elderly man in a navy pea coat, his white hair dusted with snowflakes. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, his voice surprisingly strong for his apparent age. "My name is James Sullivan. I believe you know my father, Franklin." "The lawyer," Margaret said, recognition dawning. "Please come in." Sullivan removed his coat, revealing a pristine suit that somehow managed to look both current and timeless. "My father passed away 3 months ago," he said, peacefully in his sleep. He was 97. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said sincerely. Sullivan nodded. "In settling his affairs, I found something he'd left specifically for you." From a leather messenger bag, he produced a small wooden box, beautifully crafted. This was among his personal effects, with strict instructions that it be delivered to you, and only you, after his death. After Sullivan left, Margaret sat by the fire again, the box on her lap, Rusty's head resting against her knee. Finally, she opened it. Inside lay an old brass key and a single sheet of paper. "My dear Margaret, if you're reading this, then you faced Blackwood and survived, as I knew you would. The courage of our line runs true in you. What you found at Evergreen Sanctuary was only one part of a larger truth. During the war, the government created 3 such facilities, insurance policies against the collapse of civilization. You've uncovered the first. The enclosed key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank of Montana in a town called Whisper Creek. Inside, you'll find coordinates to the second facility, Project Timberwolf. The third facility remains hidden, even from me. Each one was created in isolation from the others, a final fail-safe to ensure at least one would survive. The choice is yours now. Seek out Project Timberwolf or leave the past buried. Either way, know that I am proud of the guardian our family has found in you. With respect and affection, Franklin Sullivan, guardian of the records." Beneath the letter was a faded photograph. 3 young men in army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders. Margaret recognized Eleanor from the photos at the main house. One of the others was a much younger Franklin Sullivan. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, "The 3 guardians, Evergreen, Timberwolf, Iron Mountain. May God preserve what we have built. 1945. Margaret ran her fingers over the brass key. Rusty looked up at her, his old eyes somehow understanding. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered. "One more adventure?" The dog's tail thumped against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or jewels, but the truth about who we are and where we come from. The stories of forgotten heroes who stand guard in the darkness, keeping faith with a promise that outlasts memory. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what we're given, but what we choose to do with it. Margaret slipped the key into her pocket and smiled. The Pierce legacy had found its guardian, and the adventure was just beginning. What legacy would you choose to carry forward? What secrets would you bring to light, and which would you protect? Sometimes the most important decisions aren't about wealth, but about truth and responsibility. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more tales of courage, family secrets, and the power of unexpected inheritance.